Have you ever wondered why, no matter how much you achieve, no matter how much you own, it never feels quite enough? A new phone, a promotion, a bigger house, another trip for a fleeting moment, there's a rush of excitement, a brief spark of satisfaction, but soon a strange emptiness creeps back in. A quiet, gnawing hunger beneath it all. It whispers, more, you need more. And so we chase another purchase, another goal, another person's approval. Modern life is designed this way. A cycle of wanting, getting, and still feeling unfulfilled. It's not because you're flawed or weak or missing some secret formula for happiness. It's because we've been conditioned to seek joy in the wrong places. Since childhood, we're taught that happiness is a destination. Something will finally arrive at once we have everything just right. The right job, the perfect partner, a certain number in the bank, an impressive title under our name. But deep down, if you're honest, you know none of those things have ever delivered lasting peace. The Buddha understood this more than 2,500 years ago. In a time with no smartphones, no luxury cars, no social media followers, people were already trapped in this endless hunger. He called it tanha, craving, the thirst that can never be quenched. And it's not just about material things. We crave experiences, sensations, even the idea of a better version of ourselves. Once I lose weight, once I find love, once I fix everything wrong in my life. But here's the beautiful, quiet truth. That moment of enough isn't something you find out there. It's something you choose, right here, right now. There's a reason why ancient sages, wandering monks, and wise grandmothers with weathered hands have all said the same thing in their own way. Contentment is the greatest wealth. Not money, not fame, not even knowledge. Because when you're content, you stop chasing. And when you stop chasing, you start noticing. And when you start noticing, you discover a quiet, steady joy that was waiting for you all along. You see, life is made up of simple, unremarkable moments. The warmth of morning sunlight on your face. The way tea tastes a little sweeter when you sip it slowly. The sound of rain tapping against the window while you're safe inside. The weight of someone's hand in yours. We overlook these treasures because we've been trained to believe happiness must be loud, grand, and Instagram-worthy. But real peace, it hums softly in the background, unnoticed, until you finally choose to listen. And when you do, the hunger that's gnawed at you for years begins to soften. Not because you finally have everything, but because you finally see everything you already have. This isn't about giving up dreams or ambitions. It's about pausing long enough to ask yourself, at what cost am I chasing this? And what am I truly hoping to feel once I catch it? Often the answer isn't a thing, it's a state of being, a sense of ease, a release from the tightness in your chest, a simple, uncluttered joy. And the ancient wisdom of the Buddha reminds us, you don't have to wait for life to deliver that to you. You can create it right here with what you already possess. Because contentment isn't laziness. It isn't settling. It's mastery. It's knowing when to strive and when to rest, when to desire and when to let go, when to fight for more and when to savor enough. The irony is, once you taste the peace that comes from being content, truly, deeply content, you stop being so easily manipulated by a world built on your dissatisfaction. You become harder to sell to, harder to impress, harder to disturb, and in that stillness life feels different. Colors seem brighter, laughter feels warmer, your breath feels fuller. That invisible hunger loses its grip on you. The great Zen master Ryokan once wrote, "The thief left it behind, the moon at my window." Meaning, you can lose everything, but if you keep a heart at peace, you lose nothing. Because contentment isn't what you hold in your hands, it's what you hold in your heart. And so, before we go any further, I invite you to pause, right now. Close your eyes if you can, take a deep breath, and ask yourself not what do I want, but what do I already have that quietly brings me joy? Let it rise. A memory, a scent, a smile. It doesn't have to be grand. In fact, it's better if it is. Because this is where the journey back to yourself begins. Not with a grand epiphany, but a tiny, tender noticing. And as you open your eyes to the life you've been rushing past, you'll start to realize the greatest wealth isn't what you own. It's what you feel when you need nothing more. This is the doorway to freedom. And somewhere on the other side of that doorway waits a truth so quietly beautiful it almost feels like a secret, one the world forgot but your heart remembers. Would you like to see what lies there? Let's continue. The world tells us that wealth is power, that it's security, that it's the answer to everything you've ever feared or wanted or needed. And so we chase it. We work longer hours. We trade sleep for status. We exchange presents for possessions. Somewhere along the way, we begin to believe that the measure of a life is the weight of what you can hold in your hands. But here's a strange, unsettling truth. The more you gather, the heavier you become. And yet, paradoxically, the emptier you feel. The Buddha called this the illusion of permanence, the mistaken belief that things once acquired can bring lasting peace. But every possession is temporary, every fortune fragile, every outward success a shadow that shifts with time. There's an old story about a man who spent his entire life building wealth. He amassed gold, land, influence. People bowed when he entered a room. He was admired, envied, and feared. One night, a storm tore through the land. His ships sank. His granaries flooded. His houses burned. And in the morning, as he stood among the wreckage, a monk passed by. The man, desperate and broken, cried out, "I've lost everything." The monk looked at him, with eyes like still water, and replied, "If you lost everything, then what is it that still weeps?" In that moment, the man realized he had mistaken his wealth for his identity. He believed he was his possessions, his titles, his reputation. And when those vanished, he felt as though he had too. But the thing that weeps, the awareness, the heart, the self, was never made of gold or stone or ink on paper. It was something deeper, and it had been waiting, buried beneath his attachments all along. In modern life, the illusion is even stronger. We no longer just accumulate things, we accumulate images, followers, likes, digital validation. Our wealth has become pixel thin, but the hunger is the same. And yet, no matter how many zeros follow your bank balance, or how many eyes follow your every move, it will never fill the quiet, aching spaces inside you. Because what we truly seek isn't luxury. It's meaning. It isn't status. It's peace. It isn't admiration. It's belonging. And no external wealth can deliver what is, by nature, internal. You can buy the finest bed, but not peaceful sleep. The grandest house, but not a sense of home. The most extravagant meal, but not contentment. Chasing external riches while starving your spirit is like pouring water into a bucket with a hole at the bottom. No matter how fast you fill it, it will never stay full. The Buddha spoke of this as the second arrow. The first arrow is the inevitable pain of life, sickness, loss, aging. No one escapes it. But the second arrow is the one we shoot into ourselves, our craving, our attachments, our refusal to accept impermanence. We believe wealth will shield us from life's uncertainties, that if we just have enough, we can outrun sorrow, outsmart death, buy permanence. But the storm always comes. And when it does, what matters isn't what you've built on the outside, it's what you've cultivated within. The monks in the forest monasteries of Thailand have a saying, "You own only what you can take with you when you close your eyes. Not your car, not your home, not your investments, only the state of your heart, the quality of your peace, the simplicity of your joy." In the end, the illusion of wealth is this. It promises to make you feel whole, but it only distracts you from noticing the wholeness you already possess. Like a man dying of thirst in a mirage, chasing glittering shapes on the horizon while the clear, sweet water waits quietly at his feet. And so, the question is not how much you can acquire before you die, but how light your spirit becomes while you live. True richness is the ability to sit with yourself in silence and not feel afraid, to savor a humble meal as if it were a feast, to walk through a garden and feel wealthier than a king. Because the joy you draw from simplicity is a currency no one can steal, no market can crash, and no storm can wash away. And perhaps, just perhaps, the greatest act of rebellion in a world built on dissatisfaction is to be quietly, fiercely content. To look at the glittering advertisements, the curated highlight reels, the endless noise that screams not enough, and to smile. Because you know a secret, the same one the sages and the mountains and the old poets knew, that the real treasure was never the gold. It was always the quiet. It was always the soft morning light, the hush of leaves in the wind, the warmth of a cup of tea held between both hands. It was always the life you've been too busy chasing wealth to notice. And the moment you stop running long enough to see it, you'll realize you were never poor. You were never lacking. You were always already enough. There's a strange kind of freedom that comes with letting go. Not the kind of freedom they sell in glossy magazines or promise in late-night commercials. Not freedom through accumulation, but freedom through release. We live in a world addicted to more options, more possessions, more accomplishments. And yet ask yourself, when was the last time you truly felt content, not distracted, not entertained, but quietly, deeply content? It doesn't happen in crowded rooms or in front of glowing screens. It happens in small, unremarkable moments. The warmth of sunlight on your face, the sound of rain tapping against a window, the way a simple cup of tea can cradle your hands and still your restless mind. Simplicity isn't about deprivation. It's about clarity. It's about stripping away the noise, the excess, the endless hunger for what's next, so you can hear the steady, ancient voice inside you whisper, "This is enough." The Buddha understood this. When he left behind his royal life, it wasn't an act of rejection, it was a return. A return to the unadorned, the honest, the essential. He taught that craving is the root of suffering. And in craving, we lose sight of what we already possess. A poor man can be rich in joy, while a king drowns in longing. Because wealth isn't a number, it's a state of being. And the art of having just enough is to recognize when you do. There's a Japanese concept called wabi-sabi. It finds beauty in imperfection, grace in modesty, and peace in simplicity. A cracked teacup, an uneven wooden table, a faded curtain gently stirring in the wind. These things aren't flaws to be fixed. They're reminders that life's richness often hides in the overlooked. In the Zen monasteries, monks are taught to cherish the plain and the ordinary. They sweep fallen leaves not as a chore, but as a meditation. They drink water as if it were rare, sacred wine. They find meaning in a single, blooming flower because they know tomorrow it will fall. This is the joy of simplicity. When your life is no longer cluttered by the frantic need for more, space opens up for gratitude. Gratitude for what is. And in that space, peace blooms. Consider a traveler weighed down by bags and trinkets, struggling up a steep mountain path. Every step harder than the last. Every new thing he collects makes the climb heavier. Now imagine another traveler with nothing but a walking stick, moving light and free. His eyes open to every changing cloud, every bird call, every wildflower along the trail. Who do you think truly owns more? We have confused possession with abundance, but true abundance is this: a heart unburdened, a spirit unchained, a life uncluttered, not because you have less but because you need less. And here's the quiet truth no one wants to admit. Needing less makes you infinitely richer than having more. Because when you stop chasing after things, you have time to notice life itself. You start to see the gentle poetry in small things, the way evening light softens the edge of a room, the tender curve of a leaf, the warmth in a stranger's unexpected smile. The more you simplify, the more you see. And what you see is that life was never meant to be a race toward acquisition. It was meant to be witnessed. It was meant to be felt. There's a passage in an old Zen text that says, "When you realize nothing is lacking, the whole world belongs to you." Not in the sense of ownership, but in intimacy. When you stop measuring your worth in titles, trophies, and transactions, you become immeasurably wealthy in moments, in meaning, in presence. And you'll discover a remarkable thing. Happiness isn't hidden in grand achievements or exotic adventures. It's here, quietly waiting for you in the ordinary, in a breath, in a glance, in a sunrise you didn't rush past. Simplicity sharpens your awareness to these moments. It teaches you that the greatest luxuries are time, attention, and the ability to savor. And so, perhaps the real art of having enough is knowing that you already do. It's sitting in a small room in soft light with no need for anything else. It's washing your hands in cold, clear water and feeling clean in spirit as well as skin. It's finding a peace so deep and natural that you no longer feel the world owes you more. And in that quiet space, between what you have and what you thought you wanted, joy takes root. Not the feverish joy of conquest, but the steady, nourishing kind that feels like coming home. This is what the old masters knew. What the monks in stone temples and quiet forests still know. That when you learn to live with just enough, you gain everything that truly matters, not as a sacrifice, but as a gift. A gift you give yourself each time you choose presence over possession, stillness over status, simplicity over excess. And in that, you become untouchable, because what you carry in your heart can never be stolen, diminished, or lost. It is yours, it always was. You simply needed the quiet to remember. Have you ever noticed how easily life slips through your fingers? One moment it's morning. Then suddenly the sun has set and you wonder where the hours went. You were there, or so you thought. But were you really? Most of us live as sleepwalkers in our own stories. Moving, talking, working, but only half awake. Our bodies are in one place, our minds racing ahead or clinging to what's behind. We sip our coffee while scrolling through endless screens. We listen to a friend but only half hear their words, already drafting a reply before they've finished. And in doing so, we miss life itself. Because life doesn't happen in the past you can't change, or in the future you haven't reached. It happens right here, in this breath, in this glance, in this heartbeat. The Buddha called it sati, mindfulness. Not some grand, mystical state reserved for monks in mountaintop temples, but a simple, radical act, to be fully present in whatever you are doing as you are doing it. Washing a dish, hearing the rain, feeling your feet touch the earth. Presence is the thread that stitches scattered moments into a life truly lived. Without it, even the most beautiful days dissolve unnoticed. With it, even the simplest moments glow. There's a story of a monk asked how he found peace. He replied, "When I eat, I eat. When I walk, I walk. When I sit, I sit." And the questioner, confused, said, "But we all do that." The monk smiled. "No, when you eat, your mind is elsewhere. When you walk, you hurry toward what's next. When you sit, you plan what to do when you rise. That is the difference." And it is. The modern world teaches us to multitask, to fragment our attention like shattered glass. But scattered attention breeds scattered hearts. Mindfulness calls us back to wholeness, to notice the warmth of the cup in your hands, the shape of the clouds drifting by, the soft rise and fall of your breath. These small moments, once ignored, become sacred. And the beauty is, you don't need to escape your life to find them. You just need to arrive within it. A child doesn't think about being mindful. They simply marvel at the way a beetle moves or how sunlight dances on a puddle. We were all like this once, and we can be again. It's not about perfection. It's about returning over and over to this moment, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it's ordinary. Because the truth is, your life is made of ordinary moments, and if you miss them, you miss everything. There's a certain peace in watching your mind and gently pulling it back, in realizing you don't have to chase every thought, you don't have to fix every feeling. You can simply be here, present. In Buddhism, the breath is a beloved anchor. It's always with you. It requires no belief, no special tool. You breathe in. You breathe out. And in that simple act, you return to yourself. The world quiets. The mind softens. And suddenly, you notice things you hadn't before. The way the evening light turns golden. The exact note of a bird's call. The silent language between two people who care for each other. These moments, unnoticed, unlabeled, are life's true wealth. Not your bank account, not your accomplishments, not your possessions, but how fully you were there. And here's the quiet miracle of mindfulness. When you show up for your life shows up for you. Peace isn't something you find at the end of a long journey. It's something you uncover in the very act of paying attention. Joy arises not from having more, but from noticing what's already here. And slowly, the craving for escape fades. The endless chasing quiets, because you realize you've been standing in the very thing you sought all along. Presence isn't always easy. The mind will wander. The world will distract. But every time you notice you've drifted and you return, you're practicing something sacred. It's like strengthening a muscle you forgot you had. And with time, your days no longer rush past in a blur. They open like petals in the sun. You start to feel the rhythm of your own existence, noticing how grief tastes different in the morning light, how joy hums softly in an unexpected silence, how even loneliness holds a certain tenderness when you truly meet it. This is what the old Zen masters meant when they said, when walking, just walk. When sitting, just sit. Above all, don't wobble, to be fully where you are, to feel the earth under your feet, to befriend your own breath. It's not a technique, it's a way of being, a return to simplicity, a homecoming to now. And in this now, you find what no possession can give you, a quiet, steady happiness, a sense that nothing is missing, that this moment as it is holds everything you need. And when you live this way, not as a rare event but as a daily art, your entire world changes. Not because the world changes, but because you do. You begin to walk through life not as a restless seeker, but as a peaceful witness. Not as someone forever hungry, but as someone already full. And that perhaps is the rarest wealth of all. There's a hunger that lives in all of us. It doesn't matter how much you have, how many goals you achieve, how many things you collect. It whispers constantly, more. More money, more recognition, more love, more comfort. It disguises itself as ambition, as passion, even as self-improvement. But underneath, it's the same restless longing. And here's the thing, it's never satisfied. The moment you get what you craved, the thrill fades. The new car loses its shine. The compliment fades into memory. The vacation turns into photos on a screen. And soon, you're chasing the next thing. Like a thirsty traveler drinking salt water, the more you consume, the deeper your thirst grows. The Buddha named this clearly. He called it tanha, craving. Not desire in the simple sense of wanting a meal when you're hungry or warmth when you're cold, but the endless, clinging, I need this to be happy kind of wanting. It's the source of so much of our suffering, because craving isn't about the object itself, it's about the story you attach to it. You don't just want the new house. You want what you believe it will give you. Security, respect, a sense of arrival. You don't just crave success. You crave what you imagine success will finally silence. The doubt, the emptiness, the invisible ache. But here's the quiet truth no one tells you. Nothing external can fill what's missing inside. You might distract yourself for a while. You might numb the restlessness. But eventually the emptiness returns. Why? Because you've been searching in the wrong place. Freedom isn't found by satisfying every desire. It's found by loosening your grip on them, by seeing craving for what it is, a restless mirage, and choosing to step off the wheel. There's a story of a wise elder asked how he maintained peace in a world so full of temptation. He smiled and said, "I stopped arguing with what I couldn't keep." And that's it. We suffer not because we want things, wanting is natural, but because we cling to them, build our happiness upon them, believe they're ours to possess forever. And when life, in its nature, changes, as it always does, we're thrown into despair. The solution isn't to deny every feeling, to live like a stone. It's to meet desire with awareness, to notice it rise, to feel its pull, and to gently ask, will this truly bring me peace? Most of the time, the answer is no. And in that noticing, something miraculous happens. The craving loosens. The restlessness softens. You realize you can want something without being enslaved by it. You can enjoy a beautiful sunset without needing to capture it. You can appreciate a compliment without needing it to define you. You can work toward your dreams without believing your worth depends on them. And when you live this way, when you trade attachment for awareness, you discover a freedom no possession can buy. A quiet joy that isn't shaken by gain or loss. A sense of enoughness. It's why the old masters spoke of contentment with little not as poverty, but as wealth. Because when you stop chasing what you don't have, you start seeing the riches already around you. The warmth of sunlight on your face, the kindness of a stranger, the stillness of early morning, things you overlooked while your eyes were fixed on distant prizes, and slowly, desire becomes something different. Not a restless hunger, but a gentle preference. Not a demand, but a possibility. You might still enjoy nice things, but they no longer define you. You might still feel the tug of wanting, but it no longer controls you. And in that space, that sacred pause between craving and clinging, you discover the key to peace. Because life will always offer reasons to chase. More money, more praise, more approval, but you get to choose whether to run. The Buddha didn't promise that craving would vanish forever, but he offered a path to see through its illusions, a practice of noticing, of letting go, of remembering what truly matters. And each time you catch yourself reaching and gently unclench your fist, you reclaim a little more freedom. Until one day, you realize, you no longer need to possess the whole sky to enjoy the stars. You don't have to own every moment to feel alive in this one. And that, perhaps, is what it means to truly live. Not weighed down by endless wanting, but light, unburdened, and finally at peace. Somewhere along the way, we were taught that happiness lives in the extraordinary. The breathtaking vacations, the grand achievements, the once-in-a-lifetime moments. And so we chase those heights, waiting for the big wins, the loud applause, the dazzling sunrise over foreign shores. But what if we've been looking in the wrong places? What if joy isn't hidden in the rare, but quietly waiting in the ordinary? Not in the distant peak, but in the trail beneath our feet. You see, the wisdom of the ages and of the Buddha himself reminds us of a simple, often forgotten truth. Gratitude transforms everything it touches, not by changing what you have, but by changing how you see it. A warm cup of tea on a cold morning, the sound of rain against your window, a sincere smile from a stranger, the steady rhythm of your own breath. Things so small, so ordinary, that we often overlook them. But in truth, these are the threads that quietly hold our days together. The practice of gratitude isn't about ignoring the difficulties of life or pretending everything is perfect. It's about choosing where to place your attention. It's about noticing, and in that noticing, something remarkable happens. The mundane becomes sacred. The overlooked becomes a source of quiet joy. There's a story of an old monk who each morning bowed to the rising sun and whispered, "Thank you for one more chance." Not because his life was perfect, but because he understood that each day, no matter how ordinary, was a precious, unpromised gift. Gratitude does not require grand blessings. It asks only that you pay attention. When you truly see the beauty of a single falling leaf, or the softness of evening light, you realize how rich this world already is, and how little you actually need to feel content. It shifts your focus from what's missing to what's present, from restless craving to quiet appreciation. The great Zen teacher Shunryu Suzuki once said, "You will always have problems. But as you practice gratitude, the problems become smaller, and the gratitude becomes larger." And it's true. When you wake up in the morning and your first thought is, "Thank you for this breath, this body, this chance to try again," your entire experience of the day softens. Challenges become lessons. Setbacks become teachers. Ordinary moments become small celebrations. Because happiness, you see, was never about perfect conditions. It was about your ability to see the perfection within imperfection. A Buddhist monk once reflected, "If you truly knew how brief this life was, you would stop postponing joy. You would stop waiting for someday. Stop telling yourself that peace will arrive after the next milestone, the next promotion, the next relationship. And you'd realize it's here, in this breath, in this heartbeat, in this moment you've been given right now. And the doorway to that peace, gratitude, a deep, simple, wordless thank you for the fact that you are here to experience it at all. Because one day you won't be. And all the things you once rushed past, the scent of a flower, the kindness of a friend, the quiet of evening, will be the things you wish you had lingered with just a little longer. So begin now. Notice one small thing, the warmth of your hands, the texture of your favorite food, the way the sky looks before it rains. Pause, breathe it in, and offer a silent, sincere thank you, not to a god or a doctrine unless you wish to, but to life itself. Because even with its flaws, its sorrows, its imperfections, this existence is a staggering, unrepeatable miracle. And when you remember to see it that way, you no longer need endless things to feel rich. You no longer measure your life by what you lack. You find joy in the smallest places, in the hum of a fan, in the flicker of a candle, in a single kind word. And as you practice, the world itself seems to change. Not because it's different, but because you are. Your heart, no longer clenched around what it wants, begins to open to what it already has. And in that space of gratitude, you discover a happiness the world cannot take from you. A joy not based on circumstance, but on attention, on presence, on grace. This, perhaps more than anything, is what it means to live awake, to meet each day not with complaint but with quiet awe, to walk slowly enough to notice. And to remember, the small things were never small, they were everything. So here we are. After wandering through illusions of wealth, chasing the mirage of possessions, peeling back the layers of craving and desire, we find ourselves face to face with a truth so simple, it almost feels like a secret whispered by the universe. The greatest treasure you could ever possess was never out there. It was never hidden in the car you wanted, the house you dreamed of, the title you worked for, or the applause you longed to hear. It was here, inside you, all along, your peace, your contentment, your joy in the ordinary, your gratitude for what already is. This, This is the treasure we spend lifetimes seeking, often in all the wrong places. The Buddha called it santutti, the deep, unshakable contentment of a heart that no longer demands life be different than it is. A heart that knows how to rest, to soften, to be enough. It's not passive. It's not about giving up on growth or ambition. It's about anchoring yourself so deeply in presence, so fully in gratitude that whatever comes or goes, you remain steady. Because you are no longer a prisoner of your circumstances. You are free, truly free. There's a beautiful Zen saying, when you realize nothing is lacking, the whole world belongs to you. And it's true. When you stop measuring your worth by what you own. When you stop postponing your joy until after the next achievement. When you stop telling yourself that peace is somewhere ahead of you. You come to see that peace was waiting patiently, in the stillness of this very moment, in the warmth of your breath, in the sound of a bird outside your window, in the quiet courage it takes to let go of what no longer serves you. And in choosing that again and again, you become rich beyond measure. Not in gold or fame, but in clarity, in wisdom, in inner freedom. You carry your wealth within you, and no one, no event, no loss, no circumstance can steal it from you. It travels with you through dark nights and bright dawns, through success and failure, through gain and loss. The great masters weren't revered because they owned more, but because they needed less. Because they saw with clear eyes the fragile, fleeting nature of this world and still chose to love it anyway, to cherish each sunrise, to bow to each breath. And so should you, not someday, but now. Let today be the moment you stop searching for happiness outside yourself. Let it be the day you remember. The only real treasure is the peace within your own heart. And you, exactly as you are in this breath, in this life, are already enough. Not because of what you've done, not because of what you own, but because you are here, awake, aware, capable of gratitude, simplicity, presence, and love. And if you have those things, you are wealthier than kings. So go gently, live simply, love deeply, notice everything, and carry this truth like a candle through the winding roads of your days. Contentment is the greatest wealth, not found in the world, but discovered in the quiet of your own heart. And when you truly see that, when you feel it in your bones, you realize you've been home all along. Thank you for listening. May you walk gently through this life with peace in your heart and gratitude in your hands.